Take a calm breath. Get into a comfortable position and slowly relax. Now I'm letting you drift into the flow of the story. The train arrived just before sunset. Soft snowflakes drifted through the cold evening air as you stepped onto the small platform with a single suitcase in one hand and a wooden box in the other. The village was quiet. Not empty, just peaceful. Warm lights glowed behind frosted windows, and thin trails of smoke rose gently from the chimneys. Somewhere nearby, a church bell rang softly. You pulled your wool coat a little closer and took a deep breath. The air smelled of pine trees, fresh snow, and burning firewood. It was colder than the city you had left behind, but somehow, it already felt warmer. The station master greeted you with a friendly smile. You must be the new toy shop owner. You smiled politely. I hope so. He laughed. Don't worry. Everyone has been waiting for you. The word surprised you. Waiting for you? You had never been here before. The station master pointed toward a narrow street lined with old stone buildings. The shop is at the end of that road. You can't miss it. You thanked him and began walking. Snow crunched gently beneath your boots. The village seemed to move at its own quiet pace. Nobody hurried. A baker placed fresh loaves of bread in his window. Two children carefully pulled a wooden sled through the snow. An elderly couple walked arm in arm beneath glowing lanterns. Everything felt calm, as if the whole village had decided to slow down for winter. At the end of the street stood a small shop with wide front windows. Above the door hung a hand-painted wooden sign. Willow and Pine Toy Shop. Tiny snowflakes rested on each carved letter. The display window was simple but charming. A wooden rocking horse stood beside a small teddy bear wearing a knitted scarf. A toy train slowly circled a miniature snowy village. A music box shaped like a tiny cottage rested in the corner. You couldn't stop smiling. You unlocked the old brass key. The bell above the door rang with a soft, cheerful sound. Warm air welcomed you inside. The shop smelled of polished wood, cinnamon, and pine. Shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, filled with handmade toys. Wooden animals, tiny dolls, painted blocks, spinning tops, puzzle boxes, soft rabbits sewn from linen, colorful marbles inside glass jars. Nothing looked modern. Everything had been made with patience. Everything looked as though someone had cared deeply while creating it. You slowly walked through the shop, running your fingers across smooth wooden shelves. You picked up a tiny carved fox and admired the careful details. Then you turned the handle of an old music box. Its gentle melody filled the quiet room. You stood still until the final note faded into silence. Behind the counter stood an old cash register. Beside it rested a leather-bound notebook. You opened it carefully. On the first page, written in neat handwriting, were the words, "Welcome. If you are reading this, the toy shop now belongs to you." You turned the page. People come here to buy toys. But they leave with something much more important. A memory. You read the sentence twice before gently closing the notebook. Outside, snow continued falling. Inside, the little shop felt warm and peaceful. A small wooden staircase stood at the back of the shop, leading upstairs. You wondered what might be waiting there, but decided to leave that adventure for another day. Today was for getting to know your new home. You began dusting the shelves one by one. You straightened stacks of storybooks, arranged teddy bears in neat rows, wound several music boxes, and carefully placed wooden trains back onto their tiny tracks. Hours passed without you noticing. By the time you finished, the shop looked ready to welcome its first visitors. As evening settled over the village, you lit a small oil lamp near the front window. A warm golden glow spread across the wooden floor and reflected softly in the shop windows. Outside, snowflakes drifted beneath the street lanterns like tiny stars. Then you heard it. A quiet scratching sound at the front door. You looked outside. A small red fox sat patiently on the snowy doorstep. Its thick winter fur was dusted with fresh snow, and its bright eyes watched you with calm curiosity. For several long seconds, neither of you moved. Then the little fox gently touched the door with one paw, almost as if it were saying hello. You laughed quietly. "I suppose you're my first visitor." The fox blinked once. Then, without making a sound, it turned and disappeared into the falling snow. You watched until it was gone. The village became quiet once again. You locked the front door, blew out all but one lamp, and looked around the little toy shop one last time before climbing the stairs. Only a few hours earlier, this had been an unfamiliar place. Now, surrounded by handmade toys, warm wooden shelves, gentle music, and softly falling snow, it already felt like home. The next morning, you woke before the sun had fully risen. The village was still asleep beneath a blanket of fresh snow. You looked out of the small bedroom window upstairs and smiled. Tiny snowflakes floated gently through the quiet air, covering the rooftops in another soft layer of white. Smoke curled slowly from a few chimneys, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell welcomed the new day. After making yourself a warm cup of tea, you walked downstairs. The toy shop was exactly as you had left it the night before. The shelves were neat. The little oil lamp still rested beside the front window. The smell of polished wood and pine filled the room. You unlocked the front door, and the small brass bell rang cheerfully as cold winter air drifted inside. The village slowly began to wake. Children laughed outside as they pulled sleds across the snowy square. The baker across the street carried fresh bread into his shop. A few villagers waved as they walked past your window. You smiled and waved back. Although you had only arrived yesterday, you already felt like you belonged. You spent the quiet morning exploring the shelves more carefully. Every toy seemed to have its own personality. Some wooden animals had tiny painted smiles. A shelf of toy boats stood beside handmade dolls dressed in warm woolen clothes. There were spinning tops in every color imaginable, and rows of teddy bears wearing little knitted scarves and hats. Near the back of the shop, you noticed a small wooden train sitting alone on a shelf. Unlike the other toys, it looked worn with age. One wheel had fallen off, and the bright red paint had faded over the years. A small paper tag hung from its chimney. "Waiting to ride again." You gently picked it up. The train felt surprisingly heavy. Its wood had become smooth after years of careful hands holding it. You wondered who had played with it, how many snowy winters it had seen. You placed it carefully on the workbench behind the counter. Just as you began examining the broken wheel, the bell above the door rang. An elderly man stepped inside. He wore a long grey coat covered with snow and carried a warm smile. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," you replied. His eyes immediately found the little train on your workbench. "I see you've met our oldest resident." You looked at him with curiosity. "Our oldest resident?" The man chuckled softly. "That train has been here longer than I have." He slowly walked closer. "When I was a little boy, I used to stand in front of this very window and watch it circle around the display." He gently touched the roof of the tiny train. "My father bought it for me one Christmas." You looked down at the faded paint once again. "So this was yours?" He nodded. "Many years later, I brought it back. I thought another child might enjoy seeing it." You smiled. "I think it deserves another journey." The old man smiled warmly. "I hoped you would say that." After he left, you opened one of the drawers beneath the workbench. Inside were small carving tools, brushes, tiny jars of paint, and carefully labeled wooden wheels in different sizes. Everything was perfectly organized, as if the previous owner had expected this moment. You found a wheel that matched almost perfectly. Then you carefully sanded the rough edges of the train. Little curls of wood fell onto the table. The shop became completely silent except for the gentle sound of your work. Outside, snow continued falling. Inside, time seemed to slow down. When the new wheel was attached, you mixed fresh red paint until it matched the faded color almost exactly. You painted only the damaged parts. You didn't want the train to look new. You wanted it to keep its story. After the paint dried, you polished the wood with a little natural wax. The tiny train shone softly in the afternoon light. Finally, you placed it on a short section of wooden track near the front window. You gave it a gentle push. The little wheels rolled smoothly. Round and round it went, just as it must have done many winters ago. At that moment, two young children stopped outside the shop. Their noses almost touched the window as they watched the train moving slowly through the snowy display. They smiled at each other. One of them pointed excitedly. You couldn't hear what they were saying, but you didn't need to. Their faces said everything. You smiled quietly to yourself. Perhaps toys never really grew old. Perhaps they simply waited for someone to believe in them again. As evening arrived, you turned the sign on the door from open to closed. Before blowing out the lamps, you looked once more at the little train. It rested peacefully on its track beneath the warm golden light. Ready for many more winters to come. A few peaceful days passed, and the toy shop slowly became part of your daily life. Every morning began with the cheerful ring of the brass bell, the smell of fresh pine from the wooden shelves, and the soft sound of snow falling outside the windows. The children who passed by on their way to school always stopped to admire the display, and more than once you caught adults doing exactly the same thing. It seemed that no matter how old someone was, there was always one toy that reminded them of childhood. One quiet afternoon, after finishing your tea, you decided it was finally time to explore the staircase at the back of the shop. You carried a small oil lamp as you climbed the narrow wooden steps. They creaked softly beneath your boots, and the scent of old wood became stronger with every step. At the top, you found a small attic workshop filled with warm afternoon light that entered through a round window covered with delicate frost. Dust floated peacefully through the air like tiny snowflakes, and although the room had clearly been untouched for years, everything was surprisingly neat. Long wooden shelves lined the walls from one end of the room to the other. Some were filled with unfinished toys waiting to be painted, while others held carefully carved wooden animals, tiny doll furniture, colorful spinning tops, and boxes filled with ribbons, buttons, and small glass eyes for teddy bears. Every corner seemed to tell the story of someone who had loved making toys with patience and care. Near the window stood an old workbench. Resting on it was a collection of music boxes unlike any you had ever seen. Some were shaped like little cottages covered with snow, others looked like tiny windmills or miniature trains. One resembled a small carousel with painted horses frozen in place. Curious, you gently turned its brass handle. The horses slowly began to move in a circle as a soft melody filled the workshop. It was slow, peaceful, and strangely familiar, as though you had heard it many years ago without realizing it. Beside the music boxes rested another leather notebook. It was smaller than the one downstairs, and its pages were filled with careful sketches instead of letters. Every drawing showed a different toy, each with handwritten notes describing the feeling it was meant to bring. One page showed a rocking horse with the words, "For children who dream of adventures." Another showed a tiny sailboat beside the sentence, "For those who believe every river leads somewhere beautiful." Then your eyes stopped on the drawing of the carousel music box. Beneath it, someone had written, "A melody can stay in a person's heart long after the music ends." You read the sentence several times. It reminded you of the old wooden train downstairs. Neither the train nor the music box was valuable because of the wood or the paint. They mattered because they carried memories. As the afternoon light slowly turned golden, you wound each music box one by one, listening patiently as every melody filled the quiet workshop. None of them sounded exactly alike. Some were cheerful, others calm and gentle, while one played such a peaceful tune that you found yourself closing your eyes without meaning to. The little room seemed untouched by time. Outside, snow continued falling over the village, but inside the workshop there was only warmth, quiet, and music. Before leaving, you carefully chose the carousel music box and carried it downstairs. You placed it in the front display beside the little wooden train you had repaired the day before. Together they looked as though they had always belonged there. As evening arrived and the first lanterns lit the snowy streets outside, several villagers paused in front of your window. Some smiled at the moving carousel, while others stood silently listening to its gentle melody through the slightly opened door. You watched them from behind the counter with a quiet smile. Little by little, you were beginning to understand something the previous owner had known all along. People didn't visit the toy shop simply to buy toys. They came looking for something much harder to describe. A forgotten memory. A comforting feeling. A small reminder that wonder never truly disappears, no matter how many winters passed or a fresh blanket of snow covered the village overnight, making the streets quieter than ever. When you opened the toy shop that morning, everything outside seemed wrapped in white. The rooftops, the stone walls, the little bridge over the stream, even the branches of the old pine trees had disappeared beneath soft snow. Inside, however, the shop felt warm and welcoming. The smell of polished wood mixed with cinnamon drifted gently through the air, and the little carousel music box near the window played its peaceful melody every hour. The morning passed quietly. A few children stopped to admire the display before school, and an elderly woman came inside to buy a small wooden puzzle for her grandson. After she left, you began arranging a shelf filled with teddy bears. There were bears of every size, each one handmade with soft fabric, carefully stitched seams, tiny embroidered smiles, and warm wool scarves in different colors. No two bears looked exactly alike. It felt as though each one had its own quiet personality. Just after midday, the bell above the door rang softly. A little girl stepped inside with her father. Snowflakes rested on her knitted hat, and she held her father's hand tightly. She looked around the shop without saying a word. Her eyes slowly moved from shelf to shelf, carefully studying every toy as though she was searching for something very important. You greeted them with a smile. "Welcome." The father smiled politely. "I'm sorry to disturb you." "You aren't disturbing me at all." He looked down at his daughter before speaking again. "Her name is Emma. She lost her favorite teddy bear during the first snowfall this winter." The little girl lowered her eyes. "It was called Oliver," she whispered. You knelt beside her. "What did Oliver look like?" She thought carefully before answering. "He wasn't new. One ear was a little lower than the other. He had a blue scarf that Grandma knitted. And one button was different because it had fallen off once." Her father smiled sadly. "She has looked everywhere." You nodded. "I'm not sure we can find Oliver. But perhaps we can meet another friend today." Emma looked around the shelves once more. Slowly, the three of you walked through the shop together. She carefully picked up one teddy bear after another, hugging each one for a moment before gently placing it back. None of them seemed quite right. You didn't hurry her. Some choices deserved patience. Near the very top shelf, hidden behind a row of wooden rabbits, sat a small teddy bear you had not noticed before. Its soft brown fur had faded with age, and one ear leaned slightly to the side. Around its neck was a knitted blue scarf. You carefully took it down. Emma's eyes became wide. "It looks like him." She reached out and held the bear gently. "It even has the funny ear." You smiled. The bear's smile had been stitched by hand many years ago, and one of its buttons was slightly different from the other. Almost exactly as she had described. A small paper tag rested beneath the scarf. You turned it over. In neat handwriting, someone had written, "Every teddy bear becomes someone's best friend. Sometimes, twice." You quietly handed the bear to Emma. She hugged it tightly without saying a word. After a long moment, she finally smiled. "I think he was waiting for me." Her father looked relieved. "I haven't seen her smile like that in weeks." As you wrapped the teddy bear in soft brown paper, Emma gently shook her head. "Can he stay in my arms?" You laughed softly. "I think he'd prefer that." Before they left, Emma walked back to the counter. "Thank you." You smiled. "You've done something important today too." She looked confused. "What did I do?" "You gave a teddy bear a new home." She thought about your words, then nodded very seriously. "I'll take very good care of him." The bell rang softly as they stepped back into the falling snow. You watched them through the window. Emma never let go of the teddy bear. She held it close as they disappeared down the quiet village street, leaving small footprints behind them. That evening, when the shop had grown quiet again, you opened the leather notebook downstairs. There was an empty page waiting near the end. For the first time since arriving, you picked up a pen. You wrote only one sentence. "Some toys are not replaced. They simply find the next person who needs them most." You closed the notebook gently and looked around the little toy shop. The shelves were still full, yet somehow the room felt even warmer than before. Outside, snow continued falling beneath the glowing lanterns, and inside, another small memory had quietly found its place among the toys. The days grew colder as December reached its final week. Every morning, fresh snow covered the footprints from the day before, making the village feel new again. The rooftops sparkled beneath the pale winter sun, and long icicles hung from the edges of the old stone houses. Inside the toy shop, everything felt wonderfully warm. The wooden floor creaked softly beneath your feet, the little stove filled the room with gentle heat, and the shelves were crowded with toys waiting patiently for someone to take them home. One morning, as you swept the snow from the front steps, the village baker walked past carrying a basket of warm bread. He stopped for a moment and looked at your display window. "It looks beautiful already," he said with a smile. "But every year, the children wait for one special surprise." You looked at him curiously. "What kind of surprise?" "The Christmas window." He pointed toward the large front window of your shop. The previous owner built a different display every winter. Children would visit every evening just to watch it. The baker smiled before continuing on his way, leaving you with an idea that stayed in your mind for the rest of the morning. After opening the shop, you walked upstairs to the old workshop. Hidden beneath a large cloth in one corner, you discovered several wooden boxes you had never opened before. Inside were tiny painted houses, miniature pine trees, little wooden fences, snow-covered bridges, small market stalls, and dozens of carefully carved figures no taller than your hand. There were children pulling sleds, musicians playing violins, bakers carrying bread, snowmen wearing colorful scarves, and tiny lanterns with little glass windows. At the very bottom of the last box, you found a folded piece of paper. It read, "Every Christmas, build a village that reminds people of home." You smiled. The old toy maker seemed to leave advice everywhere. You carried everything downstairs and cleared the large display window. For hours, you worked slowly and carefully. First, you covered the floor with soft white fabric that looked like fresh snow. Then you placed the tiny cottages along winding little streets. You added miniature pine trees dusted with white paint and positioned tiny lanterns beside each path. A wooden bridge crossed a frozen stream made from polished glass, while a small train circled the entire village on narrow tracks hidden beneath the snow. The final piece was a tiny Christmas tree standing proudly in the middle of the miniature square. You decorated it with beads no larger than grains of rice and topped it with a tiny golden star. When you finished, you stepped back and admired the scene. It looked less like a toy display and more like a peaceful little world where winter lasted forever. As the afternoon faded into evening, you switched on the tiny lights hidden among the houses. Warm golden windows began glowing one by one. The miniature lanterns lit the snowy streets, and the little train slowly began its journey around the village. At the same moment, you wound the carousel music box. Its gentle melody floated through the shop and drifted softly outside each time the door opened. It didn't take long for people to notice. The first visitors were two brothers wrapped in oversized scarves. They pressed their hands against the glass and watched the little train complete its first circle. A few minutes later, 3 more children arrived with their parents. Soon, the sidewalk outside the shop was filled with smiling faces. Nobody spoke very loudly, They simply watched the tiny village come to life beneath the warm lights. Later that evening, Emma returned with her father. She still carried the teddy bear you had given her, holding it safely beneath her coat. She smiled the moment she saw the display. "It looks like our village," she whispered. Her father nodded. "I think that's exactly what it is." You stood quietly behind the counter, watching everyone through the window. The toys themselves had not changed. They were still made of wood, cloth, paint, and careful hands. Yet tonight they had become something else. They had become stories. They had become memories waiting to happen. When the last visitors finally went home and the village streets grew quiet again, you turned off all the lights except those inside the display. The tiny houses continued glowing beneath the falling snow, and the little train completed one final journey before coming to a gentle stop. You smiled to yourself. Tomorrow morning, children would return to see the village again, searching for details they had missed the night before. And somehow, you knew that every snowy evening until Christmas, this little window would bring a little more wonder to everyone who stopped to look. Christmas came and went, but the warmth it had brought to the village remained. Snow still covered the streets, and every morning the rooftops shimmered beneath a fresh layer of white. The Christmas window display continued to attract visitors, even after the holiday had passed. Children still stopped to watch the little train circle the miniature village, and many adults smiled just as brightly, remembering winters from long ago. One quiet morning, while you were dusting the shelves, you found a folded letter tucked inside the leather notebook. You were certain it had not been there before. The paper had turned slightly yellow with age, and the edges were soft from being opened many times. Carefully, you unfolded it. A toy becomes more valuable when someone helps create it. If the workshop is ever filled with laughter again, leave the door open. You read the message twice before gently folding it again. As you looked around the shop, an idea slowly began to grow. That afternoon, you walked through the village, placing small handwritten invitations on the bakery door, the library window, and the notice board beside the church. Each invitation read, "Toy Making Afternoon. Come build a simple wooden toy. No experience needed. Hot tea and warm cookies will be waiting." When you returned to the shop, you spent the rest of the day preparing the upstairs workshop. You cleaned the old workbench until the wood shone softly in the afternoon light. You arranged small carving tools, paintbrushes, pots of colorful paint, smooth pieces of pine wood, tiny wheels, ribbons, buttons, and soft fabric. Everything was simple enough for beginners, but carefully organized so that nobody would feel nervous about trying. The following afternoon, just as snow began falling once again, the first knock came at the door. It was Emma and her father. She hugged her teddy bear with one arm while carrying a small basket of homemade cookies with the other. "I thought we could share these," she said shyly. Not long afterward, the elderly man who had once owned the little wooden train arrived. Then came the village baker, still wearing his flour-covered apron. A schoolteacher brought 6 excited children, each stamping snow from their boots before stepping inside. Before long, the little shop was filled with quiet conversations, gentle laughter, and the comforting sound of people discovering something new together. You led everyone upstairs. For a moment, the old workshop became completely silent. The visitors slowly looked around the room, taking in the shelves, the unfinished toys, the old tools, and the round frosted window. "It feels like time stopped here," the schoolteacher whispered. You smiled. Maybe today it starts moving again. Everyone chose a simple project. Some children wanted to paint little wooden animals. Others decided to build toy boats or spinning tops. The baker surprised everyone by choosing to carve a tiny rocking horse. Emma carefully picked up the pieces for a small wooden rabbit. You moved quietly from table to table, offering gentle advice whenever someone asked for help. There was no rush. No competition. If someone made a mistake, they simply laughed and tried again. Paint found its way onto sleeves and fingertips. Tiny curls of wood collected on the floor beneath the workbench. The workshop, silent for so many years, slowly filled with life once more. As the afternoon passed, warm tea was poured into simple ceramic cups, and plates of homemade cookies disappeared one by one. Outside, snowflakes continued drifting past the round window, while inside the workshop glowed with golden light and cheerful conversation. Emma carried her little wooden rabbit to you. "I think I'm finished." You looked carefully at her work. One ear was slightly larger than the other, and the paint wasn't perfectly even. "It looks wonderful," you said. She frowned a little. "But it isn't perfect." You smiled and opened the old notebook resting on the corner of the workbench. Turning through the pages, you found a sentence written years ago. "Handmade things should always keep one small imperfection. That's how they remember the hands that created them." Emma read the words quietly. Then she looked back at her rabbit. "I think I like the big ear." "I think I do too." As evening approached, everyone placed their finished toys on the large workbench. Tiny foxes stood beside painted boats. Wooden birds rested next to spinning tops. The rocking horse, carved by the baker, leaned ever so slightly to one side, making everyone laugh. None of the toys were exactly alike, and that made them even more beautiful. Before everyone left, you suggested one final idea. "Why don't we place every toy in the front window tomorrow?" The children looked at one another excitedly. "Our toys?" You nodded. "So everyone walking through the village can see what you created." The next morning, the display window looked different from ever before. Alongside the old handmade toys now stood the new creations of the village itself. As people stopped outside to admire the window, they didn't ask which toys were the most beautiful. Instead, they searched for the ones they had made themselves, pointing them out with quiet pride. Watching from inside the shop, you realized something the previous owner had understood long ago. A toy shop was never only about the toys. It was about bringing people together, one small memory at a time. By the middle of January, winter had settled comfortably over the village. Snow covered every rooftop, every fence, and every quiet path that led into the forest. The river had frozen completely, and each morning the trees sparkled beneath a layer of silver frost. The toy shop had become busier than ever, not because people needed more toys, but because they enjoyed spending time there. Some visitors came to warm their hands beside the little stove. Others came to listen to the music boxes or simply to watch the toy train circle the snowy village in the front window. Even on the quietest days, the shop never felt empty. One afternoon, while you were arranging a shelf of wooden animals, the wind outside began to grow stronger. At first, only a few snowflakes danced across the windows, but within an hour the sky had turned a deep gray. The lanterns along the street began to sway, and the snow fell so heavily that the houses across the road slowly disappeared behind a curtain of white. The baker hurried into the shop, brushing snow from his coat. "The weather is changing quickly," he said. "The old bridge has already disappeared beneath the snow. I think everyone will stay indoors tonight." You looked outside. The storm seemed to grow stronger every minute. Before long, the church bell rang 3 slow times across the village. It was the signal everyone recognized. A winter storm was arriving. You walked to the front door and lit the lantern hanging beside the entrance. Its warm light glowed softly against the falling snow. Then you added another log to the stove, and the room filled with the comforting smell of burning pine. Somehow, the little shop felt even cozier while the storm raged outside. Just before sunset, the door opened again. Emma stepped inside with her father, followed by the elderly man who had once owned the little wooden train. A few minutes later, the schoolteacher arrived with 2 children whose parents were still working at the bakery. Soon after, several more neighbors came through the door, each carrying snow on their coats and grateful smiles on their faces. "It looks like we're all spending the evening together," the baker laughed. No one seemed disappointed. In fact, everyone looked relieved. You brought extra chairs from upstairs, and before long a circle had formed around the little stove. Someone poured hot tea into waiting cups. The baker shared fresh cinnamon rolls he had baked that morning. Emma carefully placed her teddy bear beside her chair, wrapping its tiny scarf a little tighter as if it might be cold too. Outside, the wind howled through the narrow streets, shaking the shutters and covering the windows with fresh snow. Inside, however, the only sounds were quiet conversations, gentle laughter, and the soft melody of a music box turning slowly on the counter. One of the children looked toward the shelves. "Could we play with some of the toys?" You smiled. I was hoping someone would ask. Within minutes, the shop was filled with quiet activity. 2 children built little villages from painted wooden blocks. Emma and another girl carefully dressed a family of handmade dolls. The elderly man wound the old toy train and watched it travel around its small track with the same smile he had worn as a child. Even the baker found himself trying to balance a spinning top, laughing every time it tipped over. Hours passed almost without anyone noticing. The storm continued outside, but inside the toy shop, time seemed wonderfully slow. Later that evening, the lights suddenly flickered. Then everything became dark. For a moment, nobody spoke. You reached beneath the counter and smiled. "I think we're ready for this." One by one, you lit the small oil lamps placed around the shop. Then you lit several candles and placed them carefully on the shelves. Their golden light reflected across the polished wood, making every toy seem to glow softly. The room became even more beautiful than it had been with electricity. Emma looked around in amazement. "It feels like a storybook." The school teacher nodded. "I don't think I've ever seen this shop look so peaceful." The storm continued for several more hours, but nobody seemed eager to leave. Instead, the children listened while the elderly man told stories about winters from long ago, when toys were carved by hand and every Christmas present took weeks to make. The music boxes played quietly in the background, and every now and then someone added another piece of wood to the fire. Near midnight, the wind finally began to calm. Snow still drifted gently through the air, but the village had become quiet once again. One by one, your neighbors bundled themselves into their coats and scarves, thanking you before stepping back into the snowy streets. Emma hugged her teddy bear tightly. "I'm glad the storm came," she said. Her father smiled in surprise. "You are?" She nodded. "Otherwise we wouldn't have spent tonight together." After everyone had gone home, you stood alone by the front window. Fresh snow sparkled beneath the lantern outside, untouched except for a few footprints leading away from the shop. The little train rested silently in the display, the music boxes had stopped playing, and the stove gave off its last gentle warmth. Looking around the quiet room, you realized that the toy shop had become far more than a place filled with wooden toys and teddy bears. It had quietly become a place where people found comfort, friendship, and moments they would remember long after winter had passed. Outside, snow continued falling beneath the stars, and inside the little toy shop, everything felt exactly as it should. The snowstorm became nothing more than a memory, and winter slowly began to soften its quiet grip on the village. The mornings were still cold, and snow continued to rest peacefully on the rooftops, but something had changed. The sunlight stayed a little longer each afternoon. Tiny drops of melting ice fell from the edges of the houses, and the frozen river no longer looked as silent as it had only a few weeks before. Without anyone noticing exactly when it happened, the village began preparing for spring. The little toy shop settled into a gentle rhythm that felt wonderfully familiar. Every morning you unlocked the front door before the first visitors arrived. The brass bell greeted each customer with its cheerful sound, the shelves remained filled with handmade toys, and the music boxes quietly played their melodies throughout the day. Emma visited almost every weekend with her teddy bear, the baker always stopped by after delivering fresh bread, and the elderly man often sat beside the front window, watching the wooden train circle the snowy village while remembering stories from his childhood. Little by little, these simple routines became the heart of your days. One peaceful afternoon, while cleaning the upstairs workshop, you noticed a small wooden chest tucked beneath the old workbench. It was covered with a thin layer of dust, and the brass lock had become dull with age. Curious, you lifted the lid. Inside, instead of toys, you found dozens of handwritten letters tied together with faded ribbons. Some were written by children, others by parents and grandparents. Every letter had been addressed to the previous owner of the toy shop. You carefully opened the first one. "Thank you for fixing my little rabbit. My daughter still sleeps with it every night." The next letter read, "The music box you made for our anniversary still plays every Christmas Eve." Another said, "My grandson smiled for the first time in weeks after receiving the wooden fox from your shop." You sat quietly beside the window, reading letter after letter. None of them spoke about expensive toys or perfect craftsmanship. Instead, every page described a feeling: comfort, joy, hope, family. The toys had simply been the beginning of those memories. At the bottom of the chest rested one final envelope. Unlike the others, it had no address. Only 2 words were written on the front: "For you." You opened it slowly. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The handwriting was familiar. It belonged to the old toy maker. If you have found this letter, it means the shop has become yours in every way that matters. You may think you spent the winter repairing toys, arranging shelves, or helping customers. But what you truly built was something much quieter. You gave people a place where time slowed down. A place where children could dream, where neighbors could laugh together, and where old memories could find new homes. Never forget that the greatest toys are not the ones people carry away in their hands. They are the moments they carry in their hearts. You folded the letter carefully and placed it back inside the envelope. Then you looked around the workshop one last time. The tools rested neatly on the bench. The unfinished toys waited patiently on the shelves. The round window let in soft afternoon sunlight instead of pale winter light. The room no longer felt abandoned. It felt alive. As evening approached, you carried a small wooden rocking horse downstairs and placed it in the center of the front display. Around it, you arranged the little train, the carousel music box, Emma's wooden rabbit, the baker's slightly crooked rocking horse, and several toys the children had made during the workshop. Together they told the story of the entire winter. Just before closing, Emma stopped outside the window with her father. She looked carefully at the display before smiling. "It looks different." You stepped outside. "It does." "Why?" You looked back through the glass. "Because now every toy has a story." Emma thought for a moment before nodding. "I think the shop has one too." You smiled. "I think you're right." That night, after the lamps had been turned off and the village had fallen asleep, a gentle breeze carried the first scent of spring through the quiet streets. Somewhere beyond the snowy fields, a bird began singing before sunrise. It was a small sound, easy to miss, but somehow it seemed to promise that another beautiful season was waiting just around the corner. You stood for a final moment beside the front window before climbing the stairs to your little apartment above the shop. Looking back, you realized how much had changed since the evening you first arrived with nothing but a suitcase and a wooden box. The shop was no longer unfamiliar. The village no longer felt distant. Every shelf, every music box, every handmade toy, and every smiling face had quietly become part of your own story. As fresh snow sparkled beneath the moonlight one last time, the little toy shop rested peacefully in the heart of the village, ready to welcome another winter someday, another child with wide, curious eyes, another family searching for the perfect gift, and countless new memories waiting patiently to be made. And with that comforting thought, you gently closed the curtains, listened to the peaceful silence surrounding the village, and let the warmth of the little toy shop carry you into a quiet and restful sleep.